Hi, everybody. I just wanted to thank you for being with us this afternoon. We'll be getting started in about 5 minutes. I can see that folks are starting to come into the meeting. Since we have so many participants, we're asking you to not use the chat feature that's been turned off, but to put your questions in the Q&A feature. You should be able to find that in the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A box you can pop on and type your question. If you like a question or you see a question that is similar to something that you wanted to ask, you can actually upvote that question in the Q&A feature, and that will help those questions that are on the most people's minds to rise up to the top of the list. And we're also using closed captioning today. You can toggle that on and off in your screen with the little CC button that you should also be able to find at the bottom of your screen. We've got a great program in store for you this afternoon, and we will be getting started in just about 4 minutes. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have so many of you here. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes. So good afternoon, everybody. We'll be getting started here in just a moment. I just wanted to run through a few housekeeping things for just a moment while we give folks a chance to log on. So we want to hear your questions today. The best way to ask those is through the Q&A feature. You should be able to find that in a button on the bottom of your screen. And if you see a question that's similar to what you plan to ask, you can actually use an upvote feature to help that question rise to the top rather than having to type it again, if you so choose. The chat feature has been turned off, so the Q&A is the best way for you to get your questions to the speaker. We're also using closed captioning, and you should be able to toggle that on and off on your own screen using a CC button at the bottom of your screen. So I have 3 o'clock and we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Sanchez. I'm here at Klamath County. I'm a professor of practice in horticulture at the Klamath Basin and Research Extension Center in Klamath Falls. Thank you today for coming to the Oregon Growing Oregon Gardeners Level Up Series session. This series is produced by the Oregon State University Extension Master Gardener Program. And it's been organized and led by a group of Master Gardener coordinators, OSU faculty, and staff from across the state. The OSU Extension Master Gardener program educates Oregonians about the art and science of growing and caring for plants. We're in 27 counties across the state and train thousands of Master Gardener volunteers. OSU Extension Master Gardeners are volunteer educators, neighbors, and on-the-ground researchers who serve their community with solid training in science-based sustainable gardening and a love of lifelong learning. If you are a Master Gardener volunteer, thank you so much for your dedicated time and knowledge. If you're not a Master Gardener, but you're interested in becoming one, we will be hosting training for new volunteers again next year in 2022. You can learn more about the program and about other workshops in this series on our website. Today's workshop is being recorded, and so it will be accessible to view along with all of the other presentations in this series, also on our website. And we'll have a link in the chat for you on that. So let's just cover a couple basic tools and housekeeping things for using Zoom. So you can exit your full screen if you like. You should be able to see a chat bar there. You're not going to use that. You're going to use the question and answer bar. And that's going to allow you to put your questions in for the team. You've been muted already, so you won't need to worry about that. Depending on which browser you're using, some of the things might be on the top of your screen. Sometimes that toolbar is on the bottom of your screen. In a few cases, I know there's been folks that have had to actually hover over the area with their mouse to get those tools to show up. So if you don't see them right away, you might try that. And if you don't see what you're looking for, you can try the 3 dots for the button that says more. So the Zoom tools do configure just a little bit differently depending on which device and which browser you're using. You could also try asking a question about in the Q&A if you had a challenge with that. But I would like to go ahead and get on with our program and introduce our fabulous speaker for this afternoon. We have Erica Sontag. She is a pleasure to work with. It's so great to have her on our team. Erica joined OSU Extension in 2018, and she's the Master Gardener Program Coordinator in Jackson County. She has served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay with Agriculture Extension, and she earned a master's degree in agriculture from Colorado State University. And there she had a lot of coursework in watershed science, some of which will probably be really helpful for us today in our course on waterwise gardening. Erica coordinates the urban horticulture program in Jackson County, and she enjoys partnering with local organizations to cultivate connections between home horticulture and natural resources conservation. So I'm so glad, Erica, that you're here with us today and able to share with us. We're ready to get started.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'll go ahead and get my screen shared here. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. It's so great to be here with you all. And before I begin, I just want to reiterate that we'll have 2 surveys at the end of this presentation. The first one will be a teaching survey specifically for me, and that will just take you a couple minutes, and that will really help me to improve on future teaching classes and things like that. And then the second survey will be for an overall program evaluation. And we really do appreciate your input. We do read your surveys and we take them into consideration. So thank you ahead of time for doing those for us. So hello again, my name is Erica. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm really excited to be here. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement before jumping into waterwise gardening. So I live down in Medford, Oregon. So I'm in southwestern Oregon, and that's located within the Rogue River Valley. And this area was traditionally the lands of the Takelma people, and Takelma means those along the river. And so these people lived along the Rogue River and all of its tributaries. And like many other Native American tribes, they were forcibly removed in the 1850s, and they were relocated to the Central Oregon coast and to the Willamette Valley. And today, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians identify their members as living descendants of the Takelma. So we will go ahead and get started. You are here to learn about waterwise gardening today. So we'll go over what waterwise gardening is and why we want to do it. And a lot of the time when we talk about waterwise gardening, we talk about using less water, so we talk about water quantity, but I also want to talk about water quality today as well, because those two really work hand in hand when talking about water conservation. We'll go over planning and design, so what steps you can take and what characteristics and aspects you should think about on your property when planning a waterwise design. We'll also talk about things like smart pesticide use. And I'll just go ahead and say right now that I am neither endorsing nor condoning the use of pesticides. There are probably many of you who don't like to use pesticides, whether they're organic or synthetic, and some of you may choose to use those. And so I'm here to really present some research-based information for you on how you can use those safely and appropriately on your property. And then you can make your own decisions as to whether or not you want to incorporate those in your home plan. And then we'll also get into some design inspiration. So I have plenty of pictures for you all so you can get some different ideas of maybe what you can do. And then at the end, I'll have some resources and links available for you. And so most of these are going to be appropriate for Oregon, and a lot of them are transferable to Western and Central Oregon. But I know that many of you are calling in from other parts of the country. And so in the presentation, I won't really be talking about plant lists and things like that specifically because those are so region specific. But I'll have some plant lists available for those of you in Oregon. And then for those of you who are outside of Oregon, I recommend that you reach out to your local extension service or your soil and water conservation district, and they can help you get started with plant lists and specific things like that to use at your house. Sorry, my slide is a little slow in advancing. So what does waterwise gardening mean? A lot of the times people immediately think about xeriscape when they hear waterwise gardening. And the root for that word comes from the Greek word xeros, which means dry. So it means dry scaping, but it does not mean xeriscaping. So it doesn't mean that you have to just have rocks in your front yard and that's it. You can really have a lot of variety and a really vibrant landscape while being waterwise. Waterwise gardening also means using smart irrigation practices, paying attention to plant water requirements, smart pesticide use like we talked about, gardening with natives, and using all of these approaches will help you reduce your water use. It will also bring down that water bill. So, a pro of waterwise gardening is saving time and money. Saving money on your water bill, on irrigation equipment, for example. And once a waterwise landscape is established, it tends to be really low maintenance. So it's really a win-win in the end. And, a waterwise landscape doesn't have to be just one thing or all xeriscaped, for example. There are many things that you can incorporate on different levels to help you have more water conservation on your property. So you may ask, why conserve water? We just talked about a few different points of why you might want to reduce your water use. But some of you are probably thinking, well, I live in a place with plenty of water and it's cheap. So here in Jackson County, for example, we're really lucky and we have very affordable water that we can use for various various uses, including on our landscapes. However, most of us probably know that climate projections are saying that we, in the Pacific Northwest at least, will have hotter, drier summers, and we'll be seeing reduced snowpack. And so we are really dependent on that winter snowpack and that winter rainfall. And if you live in Southwestern Oregon, you may know that we are in a pretty big drought right now, and that our spring was very dry. And so, you know, this might be applicable to those of you in different regions as well. So while you may have access to plenty of water now, in a lot of places, there are projections that we will have less water. And so it's a really great idea to start to adapt our landscapes now, you know, in case those situations come, you know, sooner than we expect. We want to make sure we have plenty of clean water for growing our food, for drinking, for wildlife. And being in Oregon, I think we're so blessed with having these beautiful rivers and waterways. And so maintaining that water quality for aesthetic value and even for recreation is really important. So in talking about water quantity, I want to share with you just a couple of tools that I really like using that can really quickly and easily help you see what your sort of local precipitation regime is, and if you are experiencing drought or what kind of drought you're experiencing. So this first one is a map from the PRISM Climate Group from Oregon State University. And this is just a really great map that shows a 30-year average annual precipitation. So it gives you a really nice quick idea of how much precipitation you get in your region. So I'm down here in Medford, and I believe that our average is about 20 inches of rain per year, according to the weather station at the Medford Airport. So we really don't get a whole lot, and we get it all in the winter. You know, so that's what we have to rely on throughout the year. So I encourage you to take a look at that to see what the situation is in your state. And then there are these two drought indicator tools. And this first one is also from the PRISM Climate Group at Oregon State. And this is really great because you can see how much total precipitation of average you're receiving for a certain time period. So for example, this map right now is showing for the last year. So we can see out here in Oregon that we are in quite a bit of a drought in certain parts of the state and not too bad in others. And if you scroll down, you can see that you can look for anywhere from 1 month to 6 years to see what your drought patterns are. And it's not surprising to see in the West, you know, that we're having some really dry conditions. So I really like using these tools, and I hope that you'll like using them as well. And then this last one is a drought monitor from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it wasn't working earlier this afternoon, so I'm not going to try it now. But this map shows in a little bit more detail how or what kind of a drought you're in. So it shows anywhere from abnormally dry to extreme drought. And it's interesting because it also outlines for you if you are looking at short-term or long-term drought effects. So then just talking a little bit about water quality, in the background here, this is a toxic algal bloom. So not something that you would want to go swimming in the summer, right? And this is a result of having too many nutrients in the water, basically polluted water. So, you know, let's talk about how pollutants even get into the water and how it relates to gardening at home. So there are two ways that pollutants can get into local waterways: via non-point sources or point sources. And the names are pretty self-explanatory. A point source is an identifiable location, like a pipe or a drain, that you may see runoff coming into a waterway. So we've all seen, unfortunately, pictures of pipes draining directly into rivers and things like that. Non-point sources of pollution are a little bit trickier, and they tend to cover land areas, and it can be really large, such as an agricultural field or forestry land use. Typically, these sources are associated with the land use, but gardens actually fall into this category as being a potential non-point source of pollution. So gardens, residential properties, parking lots, driveways, things like that. So you may think that, you know, you live on maybe a third of an acre and things like that. That's not really a large land area, but when you put together all of the residential areas that we have in the regions that we live in, that can become a pretty significant source of pollution if we're not using pesticides correctly, if we choose to use those on our property. So it's important to keep that in mind, and we'll talk more about it later. And then this graphic, I just wanted to share because it sort of quickly and easily illustrates what can happen to pesticides once they are in the environment. And this can apply to some fertilizers as well, or some of these processes rather applied to fertilizers. So typically pesticides and some fertilizers can enter the environment by running off into streams. So if a pesticide is applied right before a rainstorm, which it shouldn't be, it's most likely going to just run off into your local waterways. Likewise, it can be leached into the groundwater. If it's a windy day, the pesticide could just blow right into the air, into the environment around you and not stay on the plant that you've used it on. And so we'll talk a little more later about how to avoid that. But I just wanted to use this to sort of give you some background information of how the decisions that you make on your home property can affect your local environment and waterways. So with that background, we'll jump into some of the fun stuff with planning your design. So initially you want to do a property assessment anytime you're doing some sort of landscape design. You can start by looking at your slope and aspect. So that will help to inform if you're going to have a lot of runoff coming out of your property, you know, if you've got a steep hill in the front yard or something like that. Or conversely, if your property is pretty flat, you know, there may be some areas where water tends to collect or pool. So you want to pay attention to that. You want to pay attention to existing vegetation or features as well. And some of the microclimates that can come with those features. Some of the microclimates that can come with certain aspect. So you may want to think about, you know, where on your property might be really hot, like a south-facing brick wall, for example, or a big boulder could be sort of like a heat island. So you want to think about that when you're choosing what kind of plants to use and where you want to put them. You'll also, of course, want to evaluate your soil to see what you have to work with. And you'll want to take a look at irrigation, you know, if you're going to want to have supplemental irrigation, or if you want to try for a no irrigation design. You'll also want to look at turf and see how much you have, see if you want to replace some with a flower bed, for example, or you may not have a lot of usable turf right now, and you might want to install a little bit for use, and maybe use like a drought tolerant variety. And we'll go through some examples of that later. And then it's also important to remember that you don't have to retrofit your entire yard to be water-wise and to be conserving water. You can go with the whole property, or you can start small and just convert one bed or install one new bed with all water-wise plants, you know, which will typically be natives. Or you could focus on upgrading your irrigation, or even just making sure that you don't have leaks and things like that. You know, basically anything that you do counts, and it's okay to start small and work your way up. For example, this year at my house, we reseeded our back lawn, but instead of using traditional grass, we chose to plant white clover because it's, you know, only requires a little bit of water to get started and a little bit of compost. And then after that, you can just leave it go. And it tends to do really well where we are. So we're looking forward to that. And then you also want to think about your design options, you know, maybe how formal do you want it? Do you want like that really sort of formal look? It can be informal, or you can do something natural, like if you want to convert your backyard or part of your backyard to a native pollinator meadow, for example. So there are really just a lot of things that you can do. And of course, you'll want to look at your soil after sort of assessing what the general characteristics of your property are, because the type of soil that you have will determine what types of plants are supported, what kind of watering you'll have to do. So in addition to figuring out the texture that you have, do you have a lot of clay? Is it pretty loamy? Do you have some sandy patches? You'll want to look and see if you have any compaction anywhere. So for example, if you want to put in a new bed next to a driveway or some other high traffic area, you'll just want to make sure that it's not compacted. And if it is, you want to mitigate that because really one of the goals of waterwise gardening also, or waterwise landscaping, is to get good infiltration. So you want to hold on to the water that you have, whether it falls on your property in the form of rain or in that form of that supplemental irrigation. We want to encourage really good infiltration so that it can soak down into the ground and that plants can use it, or so that it can recharge groundwater. So usually if you're gardening with natives, the rule of thumb is that natives are pretty well adapted to their native soils and they don't need a lot of amendment. But a good rule of thumb to stick with is using about 1/3 of amendment or organic material per 2/3 or per 2 parts native soil. And depending on what kind of soil you're working with or what you're looking to do, there are different amendments that can serve different purposes. So if you're looking to increase organic matter, you can add compost. And if you want to increase porosity, like if you've got a lot of clay, you can add some coconut coir or compost as well. And so coconut coir is a sustainable alternative to peat moss. And if you want to learn more about it, I put a little article at the bottom here for those of you who are interested in reading. So again, the goal is to increase infiltration so that we can get the plants to use the water that we have already on our property to recharge that groundwater and to potentially even mitigate the flow of pollutants or soil off property. And so you may want to go as far as getting your soil tested also and looking at the overall quality. If you've never done that before, it might be a good idea to send some samples off to the lab. And in the resources section of this talk, I've included some articles from OSU Extension on how to collect soil samples from your yard or garden, some labs that you can use in Oregon, so where to send your materials depending on where you live and what you're looking to have tested. And then also how to interpret your results. And this is a picture of a soil core, and it makes taking soil samples really easy. So check in with your local extension office or your soil and water conservation district, and one or the other probably has some available for you to borrow. We have some of these available at the Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center if you live down in Southwestern Oregon. You may also just want to test your soil at home just for texture, and the jar test and the ribbon test are 2 really easy ways to do this. So this is an example of the jar test here. And the way you do this is to scrape off the top organic matter layer of the soil that you're looking to test and dig down to that mineral soil and fill up a jar about halfway with the soil sample and the rest of the way with water. And you can see in this picture, I didn't do a super great job of getting that organic material off, but I think you get the idea. And you shake that up really well, and then you let it sit for a couple hours, and basically all of the particles will settle out, and the clay will be the finest material, and that will settle out on the top, and that actually takes the longest to settle out as well. And then below that, you'll have your silt and your sand layers. And conversely, there's the ribbon test that you can do where you wet some soil and roll it between your palms to get a ball. And then when you press it between your thumb and forefinger, depending on how long that ribbon becomes, you'll be able to tell how much clay and how much silt and sand are in there. And there's some really great resources online for how to do that. And then I also have a link here for how to collect a soil sample from your yard. This is a fun video guide that I made with my colleague when we taught a class on how to take soil samples. So after you've taken a look at your soils, you'll want to get to plant selection. So with waterwise gardening, we always say choose native when possible, and that's because natives are already acclimated to the climate, to the precipitation patterns of your region. And so, you know, it'll be really easy to work with them. And you won't be sort of working against nature when you use them. And if you want a little bit of variety, you know, maybe something a little different, at least try to choose plants that are adapted to your local climate. So for example, I live in a Mediterranean climate here, on the West Coast of the States. So, you know, if I'm going to plant something different that's maybe not native, I might choose some plants that are Mediterranean adapted from other regions of the world. And again, that's just because they'll already be adapted to temperature and precipitation regimes. And, you know, waterwise gardening, I like to think of it as sort of ecological gardening as well. You know, different regions have so many native plants to offer, and waterwise gardening really gives you this unique opportunity to sort of showcase those and create this really unique landscape that can also be really low maintenance and low cost in the long run. So there are a lot of pluses. Things like shrubs and bulbs will give you year-round interests as well and can be low water use. So I recommend looking at some of those. And in addition to considering your site conditions, it's important to consider local ecology as well. So a lot of these waterwise and native plants will support native wildlife as well, including pollinators. So you can really check a lot of boxes off with waterwise gardening. And of course, we want to fertilize appropriately because if we're using a lot of fertilizer, even compost, you know, sometimes homemade compost, can be added, or too much can be added. And, you know, a plant might take up too much nitrogen, for example, and get a little bit too leggy. So sometimes more is not always better. And you want to make sure that you're not adding too much also, because you don't want any excess to be running off into your local waterways after a storm event or something like that. And then you also want to zone your plants properly. So hydrozoning is really important, and that's where you group plants with similar water needs. So that will help to ensure that, you know, plants that don't need a whole lot of water aren't getting too much, and vice versa, that plants that do need a lot of water aren't getting enough. And then again, when you're zoning your plants, this is where the site factors like aspect come into play and microclimates. You want to pay attention to heat radiating objects, you know, like if you have a big boulder feature somewhere, making sure that you're using plants that might be a little bit more heat tolerant. And then of course, considering sun and shade, the right plant in the right place is probably one of the most important concepts in gardening, which I'm sure most of you know. And then this little chart just sort of outlines really easily different types of hydrozones. So you'll see that most natives are considered to need very low water. And, you know, most plants, including natives, need some supplemental irrigation for initial establishment. But once they're established, you know, and if they're healthy, many natives won't need much supplemental irrigation, if any, to look good in the landscape. And then just to compare, you can see when you come down that turf grass and vegetable gardens tend to take a lot of water. So this is just something good to keep in mind when you're laying out your landscape design. And then I just want to talk a little bit about evapotranspiration, because that's really what drives a plant's water needs. And in addition, a lot of cities, like the city of Medford, for example, will use evapotranspiration rates to come up with lawn watering schedules. So check in with your local city to see if they have something like this available for you to use. And so basically, during the growing season, the city, I'll use the city of Medford, for example, will look at evapotranspiration rates weekly and then use those to calculate for you how much water you should be putting on your lawn. So it makes it really easy. And so evapotranspiration is just that combined process of evaporative losses from the soil and transpiration losses from the plants. So those two processes together equal the amount of soil moisture that's lost through, or equal the amount of water that's lost through the soil to the atmosphere. And things like temperatures, relative humidity, wind, total soil coverage by plants, all of those factors play into how much water is lost through evapotranspiration every day. So with smart irrigation and conserving water, we already talked about that some cities will provide irrigation schedules for you. So check in with them about that to make sure that you're not watering too much or too little. And those schedules will give you the right frequency, intensity with which to water. And you also want to make sure that you're using the right equipment. So this standard spray head here might not be the best choice for this small patch of lawn because you can see how much of the sidewalk is being watered. So something like this rotor head might be more appropriate. So something like this, you can adjust the exact angle that you want this to rotate at, and it will only get onto the grass and not the sidewalk if done right. And then for things like vegetable beds and flower beds, drip irrigation is really your best choice because that water is getting right there to the root zone. So it's getting exactly where you want it and it's not getting anywhere you don't need it. And I included this link here to the Irrigation Association because they just do a really great job of showcasing a bunch of different smart irrigation technologies. So I'll show you that really quick. So these days they make all kinds of weather-based controllers or soil-based controllers. So these irrigation systems will be able to sense either how much moisture is in the soil. They can look at relative humidity, temperature, wind, and things like that to help you prevent unnecessary watering. So in the long run, these can really help you save a lot of money and help save a lot of water. And then another really important rule about watering is to water deeply and infrequently. And that's really well illustrated by this picture on the right-hand side. So we can see what happens if we water unevenly the side here that has the emitter on the left-hand side. You can see how the roots have developed really, really deep. And so watering down several inches, sometimes up to 18 inches is recommended, depending on if you're watering trees or shrubs or plants. But basically the roots will go where the water is. And so if we water really deeply and infrequently, that will encourage that really deep root growth. You can imagine that if you only watered until the water infiltrated about 1/2 inch and that was it, that the root zone wouldn't go very far, right? Because they wouldn't know, or they'd be looking for the low hanging fruit, so to say. So it's really important to do that. And then on the left-hand side here is a really great graphic to show how water moves through different soil types. And so you can imagine that with the soil type A here, the sandy soil, that water just really flows through really quickly. And unless you have plants that are really well adapted to sandy soil, that's not really going to help you, with your conserving water and using it effectively. So the B graphic here is probably the best, and this is a sort of loamy type where you're getting good even infiltration, and you'll get some good root development there. And then C shows sort of what happens with clay soils. The water doesn't infiltrate very far. It's got really, really slow infiltration rates. And if you live anywhere with clay soils, you know that they tend to stay waterlogged for a long time. But ironically, that water isn't always available to the plants to use. So in your landscape, when you can, it's a good idea to get a nice sort of middle of the road soil texture going to make sure that your plants are happy. And then with turf grass, it is okay to have lawn on a waterwise property. You know, especially if you have kids or pets, it's nice to have a little patch of grass to walk around on. So it's totally okay to have that. You can see this pathway sort of goes in between these nicely landscaped areas. So there are some things that you can do to have a healthy lawn and reduce your water use. So one of the first things you can do is to mow a little bit higher than maybe you've been doing in the past. So the good rule of thumb is to not take any more than 1/3 of the height off of a blade of grass. If you take more than that, then it tends to be stressed and it won't put a lot of energy into root development. And we really want good root development so that it can, you know, draw that water up, especially in times of drought. Also, if you leave your grass a little bit higher, it shades weeds out. So that reduces the need for some sort of weed mitigation. So those are some easy things to remember. There are alternatives to turf grass, though, to traditional turf grass. In this picture on the right, this is an example of, it looks like a creeping thyme or maybe creeping oregano ground cover. So there are different ground covers that you can use in place of grass, and there are actually all kinds of really cool lawn mixes these days. And I'm just going to take us to PT Lawn Seed, and I'm not endorsing this company or criticizing those, which I'm not mentioning. I just like to show these folks because they have some pictures that are easily available. But you can see that all of these mixes here are drought tolerant, and a lot of them incorporate different clovers or different wildflowers. There are some that are no-mow, and a lot of these take really, really low water. So there are so many options out there if you really like that classic green lawn look. There are varieties of grass seed and lawn mixes out there that can help you achieve that, but also using less water at the same time. And then finally, mulch. You know, once you've got everything planted and figured the way you want it, mulch is really, really important. It not only helps with weed suppression, but it also helps with that temperature regulation and keeping the soil and everything in place. It will both reduce evaporation and increase infiltration. So it'll help keep that soil moisture balance more where you want it. And there will be less of a flux for your plants, so they'll be a little bit happier. And there are a lot of different mulches to choose from, whether it's organic or inorganic. You know, you can have rock mulch, straw. I've seen even hazelnut shells available to use as mulch. And then of course there's rock and things like that, decomposed granite even, if you wanted to use that. So it's just important to think about your, you know, what you want to use it for. And then also, you know, what works for your landscape. So for example, I live in Jackson County, and we tend to have a high risk of fires in the summer. And so I may choose to use a rock mulch around my house instead of a bark mulch, for example. So just do a little bit of research and see what might work best for you. So now we'll talk a little bit about smart and safe pesticide use. So when you are making a decision on how to manage a pest, we'll always recommend to use the least toxic approach first. You know, especially for most homeowners, our land sizes are small enough that we can use methods other than chemical controls. So I'll go through some of those for you right now. So the first of those categories is cultural control. So that basically means not giving the pest, whether it's a weed or an insect or a fungus, the opportunity to take hold. So for example, with watering, it's generally recommended to water between about midnight and 6 a.m. if you're watering a lawn. So this reduces evaporative losses. You know, if you can imagine if you water in the middle of the day, a lot of that's just going to go right up, especially if it's, you know, 90 degrees and sunny. But it's also best to water during times when your grass is naturally going to be wet from dew anyway. So basically you want to hit that window where you're watering at that time where you're minimizing evaporative losses, but that you're not increasing the overall time that the plant is spending being wet. So if you water, say at 7 o'clock in the evening, there might not be enough time for the grass to dry off again before getting wet from dew. And that might invite some pathogens. So just sort of pay attention on your property and see, you know, when does that dew come in? Maybe you don't stay up till midnight or 1 a.m., but that's generally a good rule of thumb. You know, sometimes I couldn't get out to water my clover seeds until about mid-morning, but I knew that, you know, we still typically had dew in the backyard at that time. So I felt okay about doing it. The next category, if you can't do cultural control, doing physical control. So I had a woman call me last year and she had just about 3 vegetable beds that had weeds in them. And she was asking me what kind of spray I recommended for them. And I confirmed with her that they were just, you know, regular garden beds, like regular sized garden beds. And, you know, we sort of went through this and I recommended to her in the end to just hand pull them. You know, there really wasn't a good reason to use that more toxic approach. So while it maybe might have taken a little bit more time to just hand weed, that was really in the end the best option for her. Next is biological control. So a really classic example of this would be if you had aphids, for example, an aphid problem on some flowers or some vegetables to bring in some ladybugs. So that's basically using some sort of biological tool to help mitigate whatever pest you're dealing with. So in this case, using ladybugs instead of spraying like an insecticidal soap, for example. And then the very last, if none of these options works for you, cultural, physical, or biological, then you can use chemical. But it's always good to remember, you know, some folks automatically think that organic is safer than synthetic, and it's not. Origin does not dictate the safety of a pesticide. So when you are choosing a pesticide, if you are choosing to use one, make sure to always read and follow the label exactly, because it has a bunch of important information for you, such as application rate. So it's generally never good to apply more than the label says is necessary, because you may be increasing the amount of chemical that could be entering your local waterways, that could encourage resistance, and it could just be wasteful. You know, there's a certain amount that's necessary, so it's really good to follow those exact directions. Many pesticides, well, there's some pesticides are broad use and some are really specific, and a lot of organic products, for example, are really species specific. So remember to read the label also to see what sort of species that product targets. If you're buying a spray for aphids that you want to use on white flies, it might not work, you know, it probably won't work. So it's really important to know what product you're using for what species. And then you always want to read the environmental hazards as well. There are some that are more hazardous to aquatic wildlife, some that are more hazardous to pollinators, for example. So just make sure that you always read that and understand that. And then along with application rate, you'll see use directions. And the National Pesticide Information Center is a really great resource. It's a partnership between Oregon State University and the EPA if you want more information on safe pesticide use at home. Okay, so let's get to the fun stuff, design inspiration. So here's an example of 2 homes that were retrofitted to xeriscape. So on the top here, you can see that they converted this lawn to a bed, and there's all kinds of great ground covers and some shrubs. So there's a lot of different texture and height and color going on there. Oops. And same on this bottom slide too. You know, I can't tell if that was lawn or not before, but you can see that there were some boulders there. It looks like they put in a little bit of turf, but also a bed with some of these waterwise plants that you can see here. Again, with a lot of different color and texture. And I want to talk about rain gardens a little bit. So these are really great for increasing infiltration on your property. and reducing runoff, especially if you live in an urban area with homes that are really close together. This sort of gives you the opportunity to keep water in your yard and help it infiltrate into the ground before running off into the street. And a lot of these are applied in areas where water is actively draining. So maybe a few feet away from a downspout is a great place to put a rain garden. And this is a really good fact sheet on how to develop one of those at your house if you're interested. And here are some pictures. And it's really important to remember that a rain garden is not, it's not a wetland. It's not meant to pond or pool the water. It's just meant to slow down the flow and to help water infiltrate into the ground. So you can see in both of these examples here, there's a bit of a slope with some rocks that sort of help to slow the flow of water. And then plants that they're not wetland plants, but they're plants that don't really mind wet feet or can tolerate more water. So you want to make sure that you're using the right species here too. And there are plant lists available for rain gardens. And then for more stormwater mitigation ideas, this is just a dry creek bed that's going through the back of someone's property, it looks like. And again, this all helps to slow water flow and helps it to sink back down and recharge that groundwater so that hopefully supplemental irrigation is mitigated. And then you can always do Pervious Pavers too, is a really great waterwise feature to add. So using pavers, for example, in pathways instead of concrete will increase the surface area that much more on your yard where water can get back into the ground. So that's something fun to look into. And then here's just a before and after picture. So these folks took out some of their lawn and replaced it with a bunch of different species. And I can't really tell exactly from this photo exactly what we have here, but you can see that there's a lot of color and height and interest and maybe a little bit more privacy or sort of that feeling of privacy, you know. And then this is a supplemental irrigation free landscape. So after having been, after having gotten established, this yard is not using any supplemental irrigation. And this sort of has that more informal or natural design look that we talked about. And I can see for sure that this is some rock rose in the front here. And there might be some, this might be lavender in the back. And then we have some bulbs growing here. It looks like maybe some foxglove or penstemon in the back. And here's some examples of pesticide-free landscapes. So it is possible to have a beautiful landscape without pesticides. And so in addition to using physical, cultural, or biological controls instead of pesticides, it's also really important to celebrate biodiversity. So those gardens or those landscapes that are really biodiverse and have a rich variety of species, and especially natives, will really tend to thrive and will not need a lot of additional input or chemical controls, you know, if done right and given a few years to establish. So the take-home message really for waterwise gardening is to choose native or Mediterranean adapted plants if you are on, if you live in Western Oregon, if possible. If not, I encourage you to look up what kind of climate you do live in and then see what sort of plants might match that, you know, if you want to branch out a little bit from using natives. Avoid using toxic and persistent chemicals if possible. You know, and when you do use those products, make sure that you're using them according to the label, and that will all really mitigate how much, you know, leaches into groundwater or how much will flow off of your property to a storm drain or down the street the next time it rains. And always follow the label exactly. The label is the law, and you'll, you know, get the most bang for your buck in addition to being safe for yourself and your family and your local environment. And then use plants to help manage water on site and make sure to fertilize and irrigate wisely, and always increase infiltration where you can and just capture the water that you're already getting on your property, whether it's in the form of rain or from that supplemental irrigation that you're doing. And then these are some plant zoning resources that I have for you. And then these are those gardening resources. And so you'll get this in a separate PDF emailed to you. But this whole slide deck will be available on the Growing Oregon Gardeners website after this presentation. So you'll be able to go back anytime to look at any of these. And then this is just a page for photo credit for an earlier slide. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Erica. It looks like we do have a few more questions. We've been able to keep up pretty well with the questions and answers in the Q&A box, but if folks have more of those, we do have time for some now. I wanted to make sure that folks knew if they are interested in credits for the Oregon Landscape Board, that we do have credit available for those folks. They can email one of our panelists, Heather Stoven, to get further information on those credits. So that's for the folks with the Oregon Landscape Board credits. And Heather's email is heather.stoven@oregonstate.edu, and realize that there is a follow-up email that comes tomorrow that will have some of the links for this information as well. So Erica, a couple of the comments in the Q&A are thank yous, but we do have a question about wick beds and whether wick beds might be practical for our climate.
That sounds interesting. I'll be honest, I'm actually not familiar with wick beds. So Nicole, if you are, or if anyone else is.
I wonder if the participant is thinking of hugelkultur type. So this is where they put very large logs and wood into a pit and then cover that with a mound of soil. And then as that wood deteriorates, it becomes a sponge or a wick. Tina, you're welcome to type in or respond if that is what you meant by wick beds. And whether they're practical for our climate. If you're thinking of that hugelkultur style, that's what came to mind for me, but I had not heard that specific term wick beds previously either.
Yeah, and if it is about hugelkultur, absolutely. And Tina, you said our climate, so I'm assuming that you're in Western Oregon, and absolutely, that's definitely a great technique to use out here.
Hey, it's Andrea. So the wick beds that she may be referring to also is where they have the water basin underneath and it supposedly wicks the water up to the plants. I know that was a method I have seen before. I'm not sure with our high temperatures how practical that would be though.
Yeah, I think I'd have to research it a little more to give you my professional input, Tina.
So Tina is putting in the question and answer that is similar to what you're describing. And she has some information that they're made from large containers, IBC or such as these, have a large pipe inside, somewhat similar to hugelkultur, but wick the water up that way.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, so with that, I would just be more concerned about the evaporation that happens with our temperatures. So yeah, I think more research would need to be done, but that would be my biggest concern, Tina.
Mm-hmm.
All right, folks. So again, keep in mind that there is a follow-up email that will come tomorrow. We'll have some additional links available for you. We do appreciate you being here today. If you're a Master Gardener volunteer, remember that you can also receive continuing education credit for today's session. You want to track and submit that time through the guidance of your county coordinator. And our next webinar in this series is roughly a month from today. It's on Tuesday, June 8th at the same time, and we're going to take a look at interesting winter vegetables that we can grow. So for our veggie gardeners, that will be of great interest. It looks like we do have just a little bit of time if someone wants to slide in a last question or two.
And I do see one question here that wasn't addressed, and it's Pauline is asking, what is your opinion of rubber mulch?
So rubber mulch, I guess I haven't heard of really using rubber mulch a lot. My professional and humble opinion would be to try to use something that's organic, or at least a natural material like a rock mulch if it's appropriate for your region. So, using organic materials, you may have to replace those, every year, every couple of years, or add a little more on top, like bark mulch, for example, because that does tend to break down over time. It does give an opportunity to regenerate some soil nutrients, depending on what the mulch is. And depending on where you want to put the mulch, I'm not really sure. And I don't really know if the rubber would break down over time. So that might not be desirable, especially if, you're thinking around a vegetable garden bed or something like that. So I would have to look more into it, but I would say just research the pros and cons, and think about exactly where you might want to be putting your mulch and what the specific use is.
Erica, having worked at a place that sold at that, a lot of people were really unhappy with the off-putting smells that came from it when it was really hot outside. Not quite like an asphalt or pavementy smell, but definitely kind of an odd, unnatural smell that a lot of people didn't find pleasant in their gardens. The best use I've ever seen for rubber mulch, though, is on kids' playgrounds. And that's the one place that I can think of where it kind of makes sense. It makes their falls easy and that kind of thing. But it doesn't smell absolutely awesome in the garden.
Yeah, that's true. And I kind of thought about that too, that it sort of reminds me of that sort of surface. So maybe not in a flower garden, but maybe in a kid's play area.
I'm going to do a last check of the Q&A here. We got the rubber mulch questions. And yep, so I think we've got most of the questions covered. We want to go ahead and thank everyone else again for being here. We hope that you've gotten some valuable information. Erica, we really appreciate your presentation. And we'll put that link again in the chat for you one more time. And it will be in your email, your follow-up email tomorrow, so that you can see the whole series on our website. But we do hope to see you at a future session. In the meantime, happy gardening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
We have somebody that has raised their hand. Well, they're gone now. Okay, never mind.